Ozzy Osbourne boarded the plane without ceremony. No security detail, no flashing cameras, no one announcing his name. He wore a plain black jacket, dark sunglasses, and carried himself quietly, like someone who had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. To most passengers, he looked like just another older rocker, maybe tired, maybe out of place. He found his seat in first class and sat down calmly. That's when the man beside him noticed. A sharply dressed businessman, a crisp suit, polished shoes, expensive watch, glanced sideways and frowned. His eyes scanned Ozzy from head to toe, lingering just long enough to form a judgment. He leaned slightly toward the aisle and whispered, not quietly enough, "First class isn't for people like that." A few near-by passengers looked up. Ozzy heard every word. He didn't react, no sigh, no glare, no defensive explanation. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and stared forward, calm as ever. The businessman smirked, mistaking silence for embarrassment. In his mind, this was a mistake that needed correcting. First class was for executives, elites, people who belonged. And the man beside him clearly didn't fit the image. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and tension was already in the air. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. The businessman ordered confidently, barely acknowledging Ozzy's presence. Ozzy declined politely, still calm, still quiet. The businessman glanced again, visibly irritated. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't sitting next to a nobody. He was sitting next to a man whose voice had filled stadiums, a man whose music had defined generations, a living legend who had nothing left to prove. But at 30,000 feet, stripped of fame, stripped of titles, all Ozzy had was his character. And he chose patience, because sometimes the strongest response is waiting. The man thought he was sitting next to a nobody, and that mistake would haunt him before the plane even reached cruising altitude. The man didn't stop. At first, his words were indirect, the kind of comments meant to sting without being called out. He leaned back in his seat, crossed his arms, and spoke just loudly enough for Ozzy to hear. "Some people sneak into first class," he said with a thin smile. A pause, no reaction. Encouraged, he continued, "Money can't buy class." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. One woman glanced between the two men, sensing the tension. Another passenger lowered his voice and whispered to his companion. Ozzy sat still, calm, polite, silent. He stared straight ahead, hands folded loosely in his lap, as if the words weren't meant for him, or as if he had heard far worse before. A flight attendant slowed her steps as she passed their row. Her eyes flicked toward Ozzy, then to the businessman. She sensed something was off, but said nothing yet. The businessman noticed, and mistook her hesitation for agreement. He chuckled under his breath and shook his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Ozzy adjusted his sunglasses slightly and continued to say nothing. The silence bothered the man. It denied him the satisfaction he was seeking. A young passenger across the aisle quietly lifted his phone, pretending to scroll, but the camera lens was pointed directly at the scene. Another phone followed, discreetly, carefully. The internet was already waking up. The businessman caught a glimpse of one screen and smirked again, convinced the recording would only make him look justified. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, but not enough. "People these days," he said, shaking his head. "No standards, no shame." Ozzy finally turned his head slightly, acknowledging the presence beside him, but still he didn't speak. That restraint only fed the man's ego. In his mind, power came from money, status, and dominance, and silence meant submission. What he didn't realize was this. Ozzy Osbourne had faced screaming crowds, hostile critics, addiction, lawsuits, and the weight of fame itself. This man's words were nothing. A flight attendant returned to their row, offering snacks. Her tone changed when she spoke to Ozzy. "Would you like anything, sir?" Ozzy smiled gently. "No, thank you." The man beside him scoffed quietly. Across the cabin, more phones were now raised. The atmosphere shifted, not loud, but heavy. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Have you ever seen someone judged by appearance? Comment where you're watching from. The businessman leaned back again, satisfied with himself. He thought he had control. He thought he was untouchable. But he had no idea the calm man beside him was about to teach him a lesson that money could never buy. The businessman finally lost his patience. He leaned into the aisle and raised his voice, making sure it carried. "Excuse me," he said sharply to the flight attendant. "I paid good money for this seat." The attendant stopped and turned toward him, maintaining her professional smile. "I don't want to sit next to a drunk-looking rocker," the man continued, gesturing openly toward Ozzy. "This is first class." The words landed like a slap. A hush fell over the cabin. Gasps rippled through the rows as nearby passengers froze mid-movement. Someone audibly inhaled. Another passenger muttered, "That's uncalled for." Every eye turned toward Ozzy. For the first time since boarding, he slowly lifted his head. He didn't rush. He didn't react with anger. He simply looked at the man beside him. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ozzy smiled faintly. Not a mocking smile. Not a defeated one. A calm, almost amused smile. It unsettled the businessman. Silence stretched longer than expected. The flight attendant stood there, visibly uncomfortable. She glanced between them, unsure how to respond. Ozzy said nothing. No defense, no explanation, no mention of who he was. That quiet confidence only fed the man's arrogance. He rolled his eyes and leaned back. "See," he said loudly. Not even a response. A few passengers shook their heads in disbelief. Phones were no longer hidden now, they were raised openly. The cabin buzzed with quiet tension. Ozzy adjusted his seat slightly and looked out the window, as if the man no longer existed. That dismissal hit harder than words, but the businessman mistook it for weakness. He leaned closer again. "People like that don't belong here," he said under his breath, loud enough to be heard. A woman across the aisle whispered someone should say something, but no one did. Ozzy's restraint had shifted the energy. This wasn't about insults anymore. It was about character. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Sir," she said carefully, "everyone on this flight is entitled to their seat." The man scoffed. Then maybe the airline should raise its standards. Ozzy finally turned his head slightly, not toward the man, but toward the flight attendant. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm fine." His voice was calm, steady, almost kind. That was the moment the room changed. The insult had failed. The humiliation attempt had backfired. Because instead of looking small, Ozzy looked unbreakable. The businessman leaned back again, convinced he had won. He didn't realize that every second of silence was adding weight to the moment. Every raised phone was recording his downfall, and every passenger watching knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The tension hung thick in the air, heavier than turbulence. The man thought silence meant weakness, but he had no idea who he was testing. The first whisper was barely audible. A younger passenger across the aisle leaned forward, squinting past the seatbacks. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man in the black jacket and dark sunglasses. "Wait," he murmured. "Is that—" He didn't finish the sentence. The woman beside him followed his gaze. Her eyes widened. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "No way," she whispered. "That's Ozzy Osbourne." The name floated softly through the air. Like a spark, another passenger overheard it and looked again. Then another. Whispers began to travel from row to row, quiet but electric. The Prince of Darkness, Black Sabbath, a living legend. Phones that had been recording for outrage slowly shifted into something else, disbelief, excitement, respect. Ozzy felt it, of course. He sensed the change in the air, the subtle movement, the glances that lasted a little longer than before. But he didn't turn. He didn't remove his sunglasses. He didn't correct or confirm anyone. He stayed exactly where he was. Still, calm, anonymous, the businessman beside him scoffed loudly. "Ozzy Osbourne?" He laughed. "Yeah, right." He waved his hand dismissively. "Anyone can dress like a washed-up rocker. Doesn't make him famous." A few passengers exchanged looks. Some shook their heads, some smiled knowingly. The whispers continued, growing bolder now. That's really him. I saw him live in 99. Same voice, same posture. A man a few rows back quietly raised his phone higher. This is unreal, someone muttered. The flight attendant passed by again, slower this time. Her eyes lingered on Ozzy longer than before. Recognition flickered across her face, but she said nothing. Not yet. Ozzy adjusted his jacket slightly and folded his hands together. His expression remained neutral, almost peaceful. He had spent decades under spotlights, microphones shoved inches from his face, cameras capturing every mistake. He didn't need attention now. The businessman leaned closer again, unaware of the shift happening around him. People believe anything these days, he said. Internet nonsense. Ozzy turned his head just enough to acknowledge him, then looked away again. That small movement spoke volumes. The cabin was no longer on the man's side. It was waiting for confirmation, waiting for the moment truth would rise. But Ozzy didn't rush it. He let the whispers grow, let doubt and certainty collide, because when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't need his voice to be heard. The whispers were spreading, and soon, silence would belong to only one man. The businessman wasn't finished. The silence around him felt wrong now, heavy, watchful. He sensed eyes on his back, phones pointed in his direction. It made him uncomfortable, so he did what insecure people often do. He pushed again. He leaned toward Ozzy with a crooked smile and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. So, he said mockingly, what do you do? Wash guitars? A few people inhaled sharply. This time, Ozzy didn't ignore it. He slowly turned his head. He removed his sunglasses. For the first time, the cabin could see his eyes, calm, steady, completely unshaken. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. I just make music, he said. That was it. No explanation. No credentials, no name. Just 7 quiet words, and they hit harder than any insult. The cabin fell silent. Even the engine seemed distant for a moment. The businessman's smile faltered. He hadn't expected an answer, especially not one so composed. He laughed awkwardly, but it sounded hollow. Oh yeah, he said, sure you do. But the energy had already shifted. People weren't watching Ozzy anymore. They were watching the man. Ozzy turned back toward the window, as if the conversation was over. That calm dismissal was devastating. A woman a few rows up nodded slowly, impressed. A man across the aisle whispered, that's power. Ozzy hadn't defended himself. He hadn't asked for respect. He had simply claimed his truth quietly. The businessman shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that the cabin no longer belonged to him. His voice had lost its edge. His posture stiffened. He had tried to dominate. Instead, he had exposed himself. A flight attendant paused nearby, glancing at Ozzy again with growing certainty. Her tone softened when she spoke. Can I get you anything, sir? Ozzy smiled faintly. No, thank you. That small exchange said everything. Respect wasn't demanded. It was given. The businessman stared forward now, jaw tight. He said nothing more. He couldn't, because confidence doesn't shout, and real authority doesn't insult. Ozzy closed his eyes and rested his head back, calm as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that cabin felt it. The balance had shifted. The moment had turned. And now the truth was ready to reveal itself. He never said his name, yet everyone knew who truly belonged in first class. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later. Her posture was different now, more composed, more careful. She stopped beside Ozzy's seat and smiled, and not the polite smile given to passengers, but one edged with recognition and respect. Mr. Osborne, she said clearly, would you like anything before takeoff? The cabin froze. Silence swept through first class like a sudden drop in altitude. The businessman's head snapped toward her. Mr. Osborne, he repeated quietly. Ozzy opened his eyes and looked up at her. No, thank you, he replied gently. I'm fine. That was all it took. Reality crashed in. Passengers stared openly now. Phones rose higher. Screens zoomed in, capturing every detail of the businessman's face. the realization settling in, the moment his confidence drained away. His complexion went pale, the smirk disappeared, his posture stiffened, his mouth opened then closed again. He finally understood. This wasn't just some rocker. This was Ozzy Osbourne, the man whose voice defined an era, the legend who filled stadiums, the name that would outlive them all. The businessman swallowed hard. Around him, whispers turned into murmurs of awe. I can't believe it. He insulted Ozzy Osbourne. That's wild. Ozzy remained still. No smile of victory, no satisfaction. He didn't need it. The businessman leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know, he began. Ozzy turned to him calmly. I know, Ozzy said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded understanding. The cabin waited. Then Ozzy added, quietly but clearly, next time lead with kindness. No lecture. No humiliation. Just a reminder. The businessman nodded, ashamed. He couldn't meet Ozzy's eyes. The lesson had landed. Not through power, not through fame, but through grace. The plane began to taxi. Outside, the engines roared, but inside, everyone felt the same thoughts settle in. Respect isn't about where you sit. It's about how you treat the person beside you. At 30,000 feet, the truth came out, and kindness landed harder than regret. The moment the plane landed, the internet took off. Clips from the first-class cabin spread across social media within hours. Different angles, different phones. One story, millions watched, not because of shouting, not because of violence, but because of restraint. Headlines appeared everywhere. Man judges Ozzy Osbourne by looks, regrets it instantly. Ozzy Osbourne teaches a lesson in humility at 30,000 feet. Fame isn't loud, character is. Comment sections exploded. This is how real legends behave. He never once flexed his fame. That man embarrassed himself without Ozzy lifting a finger. People didn't share the video to laugh. They shared it to learn. By the time the plane reached the gate, the cabin had returned to normal, but the weight of what happened lingered. Ozzy stood, collected his bag, and waited his turn like everyone else. No wave, no announcement, no entourage. As he walked down the aisle, a few passengers nodded quietly. One whispered, "Thank you." Another simply placed a hand over their heart. Ozzy smiled politely and stepped off the plane. The businessman stayed seated longer than everyone else. When he finally stood, his shoulders were slumped. The confidence he boarded with was gone, replaced by something heavier. Reflection. He avoided the cameras, avoided the eyes, because some lessons don't need punishment. They change you. The video continued spreading for days. Millions of views turned into millions of conversations. About judging by appearance. About respect. About the kind of power that doesn't shout. Ozzy never commented publicly. He didn't need to. His message was already clear. Fame fades, character doesn't. And that was the reason the story lasted. Not because a man was exposed, but because a legend showed grace. If you believe respect matters more than status, type respect in the comments and follow for more true life stories.